Well, I thought I'd start out tonight. Of course, the program's changed a little bit. We had the anniversary, unfortunately, of the 5 years since Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 disappeared. You probably should stay away from that thing. And that was a traumatic event, and unfortunately, I really don't have a lot of new news about that. Mostly what we've found are pieces. I've looked at some pieces of the aircraft, and they don't give us a lot of clues. They give us some clues, but not many. So I don't think we're going to spend much time on that tonight. We will talk about it a little bit. The other thing, of course, is in the news right now, which is the Ethiopian Air crash and the Lion Air, which was just preceding that back in October last year, that seemed to have similarities. We'll talk about that. Have some new information on that I can give you tonight before it ends up on CNN. So, the other thing tonight I'd like to talk about is, what do these things all have in common? As an accident investigator for many years now, I won't even say how many, I think 25 or so at least. But as an accident investigator looking at these accidents, one thing I've learned is that the accident cause is rarely, if ever, on the site of the accident itself. Almost always the cause happens long before the airplane takes off, long before the pilot gets on the airplane, long before the pilot even gets his license. He's thinking about things that we're going to talk about tonight. The other thing that goes even further back than that is the engineering that goes into the airplanes, the engineering that goes into how things are engineered. If there's any engineers in here, you know that what we do is make assumptions. We assume that things will go this way. And if they continue to go that way, then we'll design around that. And we're going to design to what they call 10 to the minus ninth safety factor, meaning it would take 10 billion tries for something to fail. That sounds pretty safe, doesn't it? Pretty good odds. Well, when those assumptions change and that information doesn't get back, that's something we'll talk about tonight as well. So then we're also going to have some time for questions and a couple of videos here of some things I've said on air that stirred some pots, I think, a little bit. When we first started covering this, I made the statement that I would have grounded the airplanes yesterday. I would have grounded the 737 MAX Air yesterday, the day that it happened, because we had streaming information available that told us it was very similar to Lion Air, and I'll show you that data here tonight, so you'll see that. If I'm getting too morose or too into the aircraft accident side of it, I try not to do that, and typically my presentations are not about specific accidents. And it won't be tonight either, but we will talk about those things, and we'll talk, if anything I don't cover that you have questions about, Debbie, I think we have some time for questions after, right? Okay, great. All right, well with that, I'd like to start by telling you about this book right here, The Why Planes Crash book. That wasn't my title. My title was, what was it? Let's see. Oh yeah, Between Heaven and Earth. That's my wife over there. I think she helped me come up with that title. Between Heaven and Earth. So Between Heaven and Earth meant that that's where we live as airplane pilots, as mechanics, as airplanes and travelers. We live between heaven and earth, and some of us don't get back to earth. So we'll talk about that too. So my publisher came up with this title, and I said, that's just horrible. Who's going to ever buy that book? He goes, they won't when they first see it. They'll walk by it, and they'll see the title, and they'll walk away going, oh, I'll never read that. And then they'll, about 20 feet away, they'll say, but you know, that's probably something I ought to know. Probably something I ought to know if I'm going to put myself on an airplane. My mother said she's afraid to fly. She's always been afraid to fly. And she said when I came out with this book, she goes, you wrote a book. My son wrote a book. How amazing is that? A published book. It was a bestseller in Colorado. It was great, but I can't read it because I'm afraid to fly. But she said she would because I'm her son and she kind of has to. So she did read it, and amazingly enough, she's not necessarily that afraid to fly anymore. Because what I point out in the book, and what I try to make sure I say at every one of my speeches and talks and lectures, is that the reason that this air system that we have is so safe is because of the people in it. Because of every single person that I've met that's in this industry wants to make it safer. They really want to make it safer. And so part of that is they start coming up with ways that they think will make it safer. But with everything you do, it makes it more complicated. It makes it more complex. It makes it more technological for us to understand. So when we talk about airplanes, what are the 4 things that keep an airplane in the sky? There's only 4. Well, there's the air. That's good. Yeah, that's 5 then. 5. But you have thrust, which overcomes what? Thrust overcomes the drag, right? We have lift, which overcomes gravity, right? Or, yeah. So those 4 things together is as simple as it gets, and that's the way airplanes fly. Airplanes have enough thrust to move forward. They have enough wingspan to create lift, and that's all there is to it. It's very simple. So how did we get from there to Ethiopian Air? Or a piece of software, something you can't even see or touch, caused the loss of lives, 350 lives. How do we get from those 4 simple things to software and millions of dollars and people shutting things down and traveling and politics and all the things that get there? I have a couple of things we'll talk about there. One of them, the first thing I want to talk about is the atrophy of vigilance. I worked with this Dr. Tanzi up at Harvard. I had the opportunity to work with him. He's one of the leading neurosurgeons in the world. He runs the Kennedy Center for Alzheimer's. He's at, I forget what hospital he's at, one of those little hospitals up in Boston, you know. But anyway, he's one of the leading, he holds the Nobel Prize for finding the Alzheimer's gene. That's this guy. He works with Deepak Chopra. Deepak and I and he worked together to come up with a program that I do usually give lectures on, and I was going to go a little bit into that tonight, but we won't have time. But it's called Dare to Repair Your Thinking. And repair is a mnemonic, really, for the way that our brains work when they're not hampered by institutionalized thinking. So institutionalized thinking is something that we do in our head to say, through our experiences, through the things we do, the things we know, we make our knowledge part of who we are. We become that knowledge, and we think that when we see an event, when we see something happen, that we think that that thing that happened is real, that it's the way we see it. And so we think that it's something we've occurred before. So we look at the Air France accident. In the Air France accident that crashed on its way to Paris, or from Paris, I believe, was caused by one thing. The training was so intent on the pilots that they said in this Airbus that when something goes wrong with all these computers that are talking, it's going to do some funny stuff with you. And so what we want you to do is we want you to pull back on the control stick and just hold it there. And the computers will figure out something's wrong, and the software will say, okay, we're going to reset, we're going to resync everything up. Makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? No. But that's the way they did it for years. And so that's what happened. This airplane, he's flying along in the dark, dark, dark of night over the ocean at about 32,000 feet, dark night. Couldn't really tell whether he was climbing or not, but his airspeed indicator started going from 300 knots to 200 knots to 180 knots, which caused a stall warning to happen, which means if you stall, that means there's no more air on top of the wing. So that means you burble on the wing, and that means you're going to fall out of the sky. So he panics, and he starts trying to do something about it. And as he does, he thinks, well, this isn't right, because we do have airspeed. We're not stalling, but it shows me that we are. So it must be a control problem, so we're just going to hold this back for a little while. So he holds it back. The aircraft starts climbing, because the computers say, there's nothing wrong with this airplane. We're just going to go ahead and climb. So he pulls it back, and they climb. And as they climb, it does stall. It does come into a stall. And then eventually, going on and on, this goes back and forth for quite some time. And then the aircraft ends up disappearing. That was our first Malaysia Airlines disappearance, because it was gone for 2 years before we found it. 2 years. And the only reason we found it was because some roving drone that they had underneath the water happened to take a picture of something. It wasn't because of the high technology, it wasn't because of anything else, it's just they thought it was in the area, they looked around and eventually they found it. So it was just happenstance. But chance of that happening with MH370, I don't think that's gonna happen. But so back to this thought of the atrophy of vigilance. When I listened to the cockpit voice recorder from that airplane, the pilot says to the co-pilot who was in control, "Are you pulling back on the stick?" Well, you see, in the infinite wisdom of the software engineers, when the co-pilot pulls back on the stick, the pilot doesn't know it. As opposed to every other airplane in the world that when I pull back on the yoke, I'm gonna fight against the other pilot. But in this scenario, they don't have that. The co-pilot pulls back on the stick and the other pilot says, "Are you pulling back on the stick?" He says, "No." But in fact, looking at the data, he was pulling back on the stick. Was he lying? No, because this happened 3 times. And then right after he was asked that question, he released the yoke. And then eventually, it started coming back again, and he pulls it back. Again, he asks, "Are you pulling back on the stick?" He said, "No, I'm not pulling back on the stick," and he releases it slowly. So something's going on inside his head. He doesn't cognizantly know that he's pulling back on that stick. He's relying on the institutionalized thinking, the training that's been put into his head, that that's what he's supposed to be doing. He wasn't consciously deciding that, he just did it. So that's one of the things that I've spent a lot of my life studying, is what happens to the brain when it's exposed to checklists and training and where it goes. What I've come up with is that there are 2 levels of awareness, 2 levels of cognizance. And one is tactical, and in the tactical level, you respond. You put your hand on a hot stove, what do? You don't think about it. You pull your hand off, right? That's not something that you have to analyze. You just pull your hand off. But as a pilot, when the anomalies occur, after you've had training and training and training and training and training, and you know what you're supposed to do and you've got it memorized, it's all in what we call the red matter up here. So when something anomalous happens, something wrong, how do we respond? We try to fit it into our paradigm. We try to fit it into our institutionalized thinking. That becomes institutionalized thinking that you use and you rely on. What we don't have, typically, as we get older and learn things that we learn, what we don't have is the ability to question ourselves, the ability to say, wait a minute, maybe something's changed. Maybe something's different today than it was yesterday. So maybe that's what I need to be thinking about. So those are the kinds of things that I work with a lot and try to figure out, how do we get people to do that? So with working with Dr. Tanzi, what he tells me is that it's not just something we do. It's not like picking up some weights and saying, tomorrow I'm going to be a champion weightlifter, because you have to learn. Your muscles have to grow. You have to learn how to do that. You have to learn how to open up those channels in your brain that were open as can be when you're a baby, because it's innate for us to recognize and challenge and see things new and experience them and have them become part of who we are. But as we develop and become who we are, we stop looking at those things. So it is possible. It is possible to change those thoughts and behaviors. So this is Rudy Tanzi. We just call him Rudy. He's a good guy. Let's go back here. So neuroplasticity. Anybody know what that's about? Probably heard of it and that sort of thing. So what neuroplasticity does is it works for you and it works against you. Neuroplasticity, your brain plasticizes, it changes, and it takes in what's going on around it, and it creates this reality that you have. That reality changes and moves, but not very much. Not very much. We have to continually move it. One of the things that shocked me when I was working with Dr. Tanzi after the Air France accident was he said that, and I always thought that you only have a certain number of brain cells, that as I got older, I'd stop learning, the brain cells don't replicate, they don't move. Well, that's just simply not true. That's just simply not true. Through oxygenation of the cells, which means exercise, moving and breathing, meditating, breathing, and really it's about opening parts of your brain in awareness that you don't normally do. I said, well, how do I do that? He says, well, here's one thing. you can start brushing your teeth with your left hand instead of your right. How weird is that? Really? That works? It's a start. But those are the kinds of things that lead to these accidents, is the fact that these pilots are trained to do things right. Well, what's right? What's right when the airplane's going nose down, hard nose down? Within 10 seconds, that airplane went hard nose down. Does he remember his training that he's supposed to push the trim down, maybe? He's pulling back as hard as he can. Airplane's not reacting, so he uses a little trim switch, which is the way that we level the airplanes to make sure that it flies normally without a lot of input. So he uses that. Well, briefly, when you do that, the MCAS system, this augmentation system that's in the 737, turns off. And as soon as you let go of it, it comes back on again. So he puts the trim down and then flies for a couple seconds, and sure enough, he's going down again. So he thinks, well, maybe I'll turn the autopilot on, see if maybe the autopilot's doing something. He turns the autopilot on. What happens then? Well, it takes on and it turns off the MCAS and it starts working normally. It's working normally. So now he's thinking, well, I better level out. So he turns the autopilot off again. As soon as he does that, the MCAS kicks back in and the nose comes back down. But you can't fly on autopilot forever. So he keeps this back and forth, and I'll show you some of that data here in a minute. So that's how that led to that. But the fact that his mind was not able or capable to realize that this was a system that if he had flipped one switch down here, nobody would have died. One switch, the MCAS switch. Well, why didn't he do that? Was it because he was routine or trained? Yes, he was routine and he was trained. But did Boeing tell him about that switch? No, they didn't. Boeing decided, let's hold that thought for 1 minute. Let's go back into the history of this a little bit. And again, I don't usually get into a specific accident, but I think it's important we do with what you've seen on the news and what's going on right now. So Boeing, when they first conceived of this airplane, Southwest wanted to fly to Hawaii. They needed more efficient airplanes. A couple of other places wanted to fly further and more efficient. So they got these bigger engines for the 737. They said, we can put these, rather than redesign a whole new airplane, we can just put bigger engines on the 737. It's the backbone of the entire industry. Let's use that, let's do that. So as they did, they had to move the engines further forward and they had to raise the nose of the nose gear just a little bit to fit these engines under the wing because they were pretty big. But when they moved them forward, now when you go to take off or when you're flying straight and level even, the aircraft has a tendency to rise, to climb. So why didn't they just fix that, tell the pilots, push down, trim it, whatever you got to do? Well, there's a real big reason, and that is that in certification process, there's a type certificate data sheet, and you design and engineer your airplane for the international community to say, we're going to design the airplane to do this one thing. That type certificate data sheet is the 737. It was very important to the World Aviation community that the price of these airplanes stayed competitive with Airbus. So what they said was, we're not going to go back and design a whole new airplane, which could take 10 years. We're going to use this one. And then also we can take pilots from this airplane and put it into the new airplane without any training because it's the same type certificate. It's the same type of aircraft. Saved hundreds of millions of dollars in training and expenses in engineering and in manufacturing and everything else. They could just put them on this airplane. So what they decided to do then, rather than to compensate for this thing going up, is they said, well, we're just going to put in some software that's going to recognize when that's happening, and it's going to compensate and move it down just a little bit, move the nose down a little bit. So in the design, they said, we're going to make that go down 0.6%, 0.6 degrees. Push the nose down 0.6%, which would make up for this. Well, during test flight, and that's what was approved, that's what the engineers said would work, and that's what they tested, and they said, that'll work. That's great. Let's do that. Then they went out for flight tests. And during the flight tests, they realized that that wasn't quite enough. It needed more. Needed more. So they decided in the field, in the manufacturing side, not the type certificate where they designed it, but when they're manufacturing it, they decided that they would take it to 2.5 degrees. So they did. They put it to 2.5 degrees. But that never got back to the engineers. The engineers thought it was at 0.6 still. Furthermore, The software engineers now said, well, we're going to put this thing in, and they had a specification that said, we're going to make sure that this happens within 10 seconds. So what we have to do is increase that 2.5% to full travel. We're going to have to increase it to full travel. So now the whole back of the airplane goes up like this, which pushes the nose down, to full travel, which there's enough area of this horizontal stabilizer that it's bigger than the elevators are. So no matter what they did to try to pull this airplane nose up, it wasn't enough. It couldn't have been enough. But the software engineers never told manufacturing, and manufacturing never told the technical designers what was going on with this thing. So what had to happen in their brains to think that all I'm doing is designing software? Think about that for a minute. What kind of atrophy of vigilance, what kind of institutionalized thinking goes on to think that all I'm doing is designing software to move the elevator, and to not consider the fact that it's part of something bigger? It's an anomaly, certainly it's an anomaly, but I'm an engineer. I've been asked to do this. The first engineer said, well, I've been asked to compensate for that nose up situation, and the next guy down the line says, well, I've been asked to make it fly like the aircraft did before because we want to be able to have pilots from here to here without retraining them. So let's just do that. And then the next guy says, well, my job is just to make sure that it gets there fast enough. And to do that, I had to increase the limit to allow it to get there fast enough. So that's where this happened. That's how this happened. What they failed to consider, and that in itself wouldn't have been a bad deal, honestly. And they've flown around a long time like that. A lot of airplanes, tens of thousands of hours on this MAX 8 airplane. So why now? Why did this happen? If I'm getting too far into the weeds, tell me. I'm looking at your eyes and I don't have anybody asleep yet, so go ahead. Yeah, that's the multiple control augmentation system, I think, or the, anybody else know? Maneuvering augmentation system is what that is. I'm sorry. I like acronyms and got to get caught on them sometimes. So everything's going good. The MCAS is still adjusting to things because it's sensing the nose up and it's pushing it down, but that didn't cause the accident. What caused the accident is the indicator that tells the airplane that it's going up or down failed on Lion Air. So it's this little vane that sticks out there. It's an angle of attack indicator, and this little vane tells the pilot and tells the MCAS system that the airplane nose is going up or going down. And if it goes up too far, it pushes it down. So I'll talk about Ethiopian Air first, but in Ethiopian Air, the day it happened, I looked up what's called the ADS-B. This is a satellite tracking system. It's a terrestrial satellite that gives data about every aircraft as it's flying, and it feeds that data out to the public. So we have this receiver, it's a software thing I buy, and I have access to all that data that's coming in. So I looked up to see what happened on this. Within hours after the crash, you could see clearly that this angle of attack indicator had failed. On the runway, as it was leaving the runway, about 3/4 of the way down, they get this big spike showing that the airplane was climbing at 2,400 feet per minute, which would be impossible because it's on the runway. So what happened next? Well, they take off, but their speed is really high at the end, and they hadn't taken off till almost the end of the runway. So I looked at the day before, and the day before, the same flight, same airplane, same airport. By that point, 3/4 of the way down, the airplane was already 1,000 feet above the ground, and it was only going 230 knots or so. But on this case, it hadn't left the ground yet. It was going 260 knots. It was really moving, way faster than it should have been on the ground. So there's still something we have to learn about that. But nonetheless, it continued, the flight continued, and these erroneous signals continued, the vertical speed indication, and the fact that the pilot was fighting it. And I paralleled that right on top of Lion Air. They were identical. Not identical, but they were the same symptoms were in both of them. So that's when I got on air, and I was asked by, I think it was Jake Tapper, or I think it was Jake, and he said, what's going on with this airplane? What would you do? And I said, ground the fleet immediately. And he was shocked because I'm very, very cautious about doing that kind of thing. I have a responsibility to not stir people up about things. Been in the industry a long, long time. And he was shocked that I said that, but, and then I got a lot of heat for it, and I said, well, I have a responsibility to say it, not a responsibility to hide it. And that's what has to happen. So at that point, the next 2 days, or a day and a half anyway, were pretty hectic, as you know. Everyone in the world grounded the airplanes except the FAA. Except the FAA. Well, why would that happen? Now we're going to talk about world affairs a little bit. So everybody knows what the United Nations is, obviously. You guys are educated world affairs people. So the United Nations has a division called the International Civil Aviation Organization, Icao. And the head of that organization is Feng Liu. And she is from China. She's the Chinese ambassador for the Icao. And she also is the president of the Icao right now. So under the World Aviation Forum, which I'm on the board of the World Aviation Forum, so me and Jalal Haider, who's the president of that forum, contacted Fyong. Actually, she contacted Jalal and wanted to talk about how we go forward with this. The challenge Fyong has is that they have no authority whatsoever, none. They make recommendations, and they go out and they do audits of airlines, of manufacturers around the world, so that they can say, you should be part of our organizations. And if you're a member state, which everyone that's a member state of the United Nations is a member state of Icao, obviously, so they have an ambassador at Icao from every one of these member states. The challenge is, because they have no authority, before they go on an audit, they have to take a member from that state, from that country with them to do these audits. Can you imagine the pressure that these people are under when they go and they have to meet with the prime minister, or they have to meet with the president, or they have to meet with of every country they go to, Egypt, Ethiopia, anywhere you can imagine that has an aircraft place, that has an aircraft manufacturing or operation, these folks have to go there and do it. So Fyong said, the problem is the Icao had never done an audit on FAA or on Boeing. Why is that? Why is that? The institutionalized thinking. Again, it's an atrophy of vigilance at every level. Even organizations get it. Even organizations get it. So as we do these audits, the organization called Icao found themselves in a situation where they thought they were doing the right thing, but they weren't. They missed it. They didn't do it right. So how did they deal with it? So we set up a meeting between Feng Liu that's supposed to happen today and Elaine Chao, who's the Secretary of Transportation. So Elaine had already talked with President Trump and with Dan Elwell, who's the director of the FAA, the administrator for the FAA, and they had decided that by this time, that on, I think it was Sunday, that they would go ahead and ground the aircraft. A little bit too, not enough, too late, in my opinion. The damage that was done by not grounding the aircraft immediately and taking the high road is going to be long-lasting for Boeing. It's going to be long-lasting for the industry. It's going to put fear in, undue fear, I think, in most public travelers, just to have that thought. So it's really tragic for the industry that that happened in the way that it did. But we'll see what they do going forward. So anyway. So it's this atrophy of vigilance. How do we get rid of it and what do we do with it? It's kind of a good tool. It's a survival tool that we've adapted and learned that we can live with. But how do you get out of it? How do you stop it? Well, brushing your teeth with the left hand isn't probably going to do it. So it's really a vigilant thing. You have to really understand what you have to do and how you do it. And I'll just touch on it real quick here. Again, we don't have time to go through it, but I'm just going to flip through some of these slides, and then we'll talk a little bit about a few other things. So these are risk cards, basically, that I give to people that are in the program. And you can see that little REPAIR, repair, around there. And that's the way that there's 6 things: recognize, environmentalize, prioritize, analyze, institutionalize, and that's the double-edged sword we were talking about earlier, realize. So those are the 6 things that we do to exercise and to bring that part of our brain out. So I'll give Debbie information about that over the next few weeks here and make that available to you if you'd like to participate in that. It's something you can do for yourself as well. So how does atrophy of vigilance live today in this technological world that we're in? The reason I just spent all that time on atrophy of vigilance is to understand why we as human beings don't keep up with technology. Technology is advancing far faster than we have the capability to understand how it's used, how it affects us, and what we do within it, and how it helps us and how it hurts us. So it moves fast. I'll give you a couple examples of that. My wife, who shall remain nameless, if you see a silver Mercedes out there with a crash on the side of it, you'll know that it's mine. But somebody ran into her, and she was driving down the road, minding her own business, and somebody pulls right out and runs right in the side of her car. So they both get out and they start exchanging numbers and doing that thing. And the gentleman that was behind the wheel of the other car said it was a brand new car with all the bells and whistles on it. And he goes, "I can't believe this happened." Well, what do you mean? He goes, "Well, if I'm driving down the road and I just get a little bit off the lane, the thing beeps at me. If I get too close to a car ahead of me, it beeps at me. It tells me, stop, you gotta do this, you gotta do that. And here I pull out, run right into you, and it didn't tell me anything." It didn't even tell me. I don't know what he was thinking. I'm sitting at a stoplight going, I'll just go and push the gas pedal and have the car tell me that there's another car in front of me, I guess. I guess that's how it works. So there's a good example right there, the atrophy of vigilance, over-reliance on technology, over-reliance on what we have available to us. Let's cut another couple examples. Elon Musk of Tesla and other fame. So Elon Musk talks a lot about artificial intelligence, and he's probably at the bleeding edge of artificial intelligence with his research right now. But he says that we underestimate it significantly, what kind of hazards and danger that it can create. And he talks more about what it will do, and that it'll become its own consciousness and that sort of thing. I tend to look at it a little differently in that what is it doing to the inside of our head? What will artificial intelligence do to us? I already know by working with Dr. Tanzi that there's a part of my brain that stops working and actually atrophies. I use that word specifically because the brain not only has less activity in this particular area, but it literally gets smaller. Literally gets smaller in our brains. And what this part of the brain does is recognize changes in patterns around us. Changes in patterns, changes in a street sign. If you've been driving the same road all your life and the street sign changes from 45 to 35 miles per hour, you think your brain would let you see that? Probably not. You'll keep driving 45 miles an hour because I've always done it and it's safe. I've never been in an accident before, so why would it change? It's not going to change. So that's one example of it. Elon Musk, again, has a Tesla that you may have heard in Arizona was being tested. And there's a gentleman sitting there in the car at the driver's wheel with his phone, or his iPad, I think it was, testing the auto drive on the car. As he stops and goes to turn a corner, he runs a woman over that was crossing the street, and she is killed. She's fatally injured. He never looked up. And he's there. If anybody should be vigilant about this, it should be him. He's there testing it. He's the testing guy. Did nobody tell him that he wasn't just joyriding? He wasn't just joyriding. He was there to test it. But yet, even he was susceptible to the atrophy of vigilance. What other examples do we have? Many of them. Now let's talk about engineering examples. A good engineering example, the first accident that I ever did the post-investigation. Just so you know, the NTSB does what we call the proximate cause investigation. They look for the last thing that could have prevented the accident from happening before it did, which is the proximate cause. That's why the pilot is almost always blamed, because the pilot was the last person at the wheel and probably had the last chance to save the accident from happening. So, and he's usually the first one to arrive at the accident scene, so there you have it. So the FAA, on the other hand, has 9 responsibilities, and those 9 responsibilities do not include the proximate cause. What they include are the things like, was there a regulation in place that could have prevented it that was not taken heed to? Was air traffic control involved? Did air traffic control cause the accident? Did the FAA cause the accident? Which, that's an important thing to remember right there. The other things that we look at are, is there a regulation that should have been in place? Was there information available before the accident that could have prevented it? And if it was, who was it available to, and why did they not understand it? Why did they not understand their role in how to do this? So after that little preface, the Aloha Air Accident, does anybody remember that one? The convertible, we call it. The convertible. Only one fatality. Only one fatality. It was a flight attendant who went out through one of the windows there. And tragic accident. Could have been prevented. But the engineers that designed that airplane, at the time, jet airplanes were amazing. They were the holy grail of any kind of airplane, especially commercial airplanes. And this airplane, this particular one, was usually used in service. This model was used in service for 2 or 3 hours at a time. It would take off, it would fly from Denver to New York, it would fly from Denver to California, 2 or 3 hour stints. So when the engineer was thinking of this ahead of time, before he built this airplane, the engineers made some assumptions, like we talked about before, assumptions. And the assumption was that this airplane flight was going to be about 2.5, 3 hours. That's the average. So if he's calculating his 10 to the minus 9 safety factor on this airplane that literally blows up like a balloon, it's metal, and it blows up like a balloon when you pressurize it, and it shrinks when it's not. So that's going to put some work on that metal, isn't it? Right? So how much work? How much work does that? Well, if it only does it twice every 3 hours, and then I calculate my 10 to the minus 9 safety factor, it's pretty safe. But in Hawaii, how long does it take to fly from one island to the next? 15 minutes? Maybe 20? So now you're cycling it in 1 hour, you might cycle it 6, 8, 10 times instead of twice every 3 hours. So what's that doing to the metal? Making all kinds of problems with it, right? So that's an assumption. That accident was caused 10 years before it happened because it wasn't anticipated, it wasn't thought about. How does it work? How does it not work? So that's another example of the atrophy of vigilance and understanding your world, your perspective of what's happening, and only in your world. So if I was to add or give you something you could take away with here, it's try to look at other perspectives. Every day, look at someone else's perspective of the strangest things. I know one perspective I've changed. I used to leave the cabinet doors in the kitchen open a lot, but I don't anymore. So those are the kinds of things that you take the advantage of saying, something changed, something's different about my life today, something's different about the weather today, something's different about my body today. I feel different today because I'm getting older or whatever. You know, everything changes, and taking that as part of who you are and understanding from the outside looking in that your perspective might be different. Those are the only things, those thoughts that you have, and mindfulness of meditating about them, that's the only thing, the only tool you have as a human being to reactivate that part of your brain that recognizes changes in patterns in your life. And why is that important? I'll tell you one thing that's super important. And again, I learned this from Deepak Chopra. And what he said was that recognizing patterns is the way that we manage risk. It's the way that we look at risk. Because if something changes, an anomaly, then it might present a new risk, and so we innately run away from it or protect ourselves from it. But he said, but it also is the part of our brain that recognizes opportunity. Because isn't that the same thing? An opportunity is something new, something that's changed, something that's different. It is. It's the same thing. That part of your brain, the same part of your brain that looks for risks and hazards and control, is the same part of your brain that's looking for opportunity. So Dr. Rudy says, well, the biggest problem now is that that's what's causing an epidemic of depression. Because everybody's so routine, everybody's protected themselves, so they can't see risk, but they also can't see opportunity. There is no opportunity because there's all these anomalies happening, but you're not acknowledging them in your brain because your institutionalized thinking says, it's the same old thing. It's the way it's always been. It's not going to change. It's going to be the same as it's always been. And that causes severe depression. And so this part of activating your brain again and looking at things from your own different perspective and looking from the outside in, that activates that part of your brain. You start looking for changes in patterns. For example, did anyone notice I'm wearing 2 different colored shoes? I'm not, but if I was, you wouldn't have seen it, would you? So that's an example of that. But anyway, how are we doing on time, Debbie? I'll ramble all night if I don't stop me. So.
Wonder if you could touch on international partners with the FAA, and are they talking about these things?
Yes, I sure will. So the FAA, without being a controversy here really, the FAA administrator, Dan Elwell, before he went to become the FAA administrator, was a lobbyist for the Aviation Industries Association. And so that's something that a lot of people are talking about right now. Did that have something to do with why he didn't ground the airplanes right away? Was it because he was a lobbyist? Well, I'll talk about this one thing and then we'll get back over to the other. But so in aviation safety, we talk about a just culture. Has anybody heard that term really? The just culture idea is the fact that if you're not doing reckless behavior and safety, then it's really not your fault. It's part of the system. It's how the system works. There's a woman that was a nurse, and she stepped in for someone else to give medication recently to a patient. And she's being brought up on reckless homicide because the person died of the medication that she gave to her patient. Well, why is that? She was just given the medication she was supposed to, but there was a mix-up. There was a mix-up in it. They have an automated dispensing system that failed, and she was supposed to see that that automated dispensing system gave her the right drug, but she failed to recognize that it was the wrong drug and gave it to the patient, and the patient died. She's in jail with reckless homicide charges against her. Is that reckless behavior? I'd kind of say not. Careless, perhaps? Reckless? No. So with that, we have to look at the behavior at the international community. How does the FAA work together with the international community? Hold on to your hats because that's going to change significantly within the next couple of months. It's already begun. Boeing and every country through the FAA, I worked on the interchange agreement with China when I was with the FAA in 2004 to get an interchange agreement where we look at all of our regulations, we see if they match. If the regulations match, then the way that they're enforced is the responsibility of each member state. So each state, each country says, I'm going to do enforcement my way, you're going to do it your way, but here's the regulation. So we all agree we're talking about the same thing. So in certification of airplanes, if I build a 737 and I'm Boeing and I'm certified to do that, then that 737 can fly in any other country it wants because we have interchange agreements with all the other member states. That is gone as of yesterday. That is gone because Canada has decided that they're going to certify their own 737s. So they're going to go to Boeing now. They pulled their interchange agreement with the United States. And they're the ones that are going to go to Boeing and determine whether the 737 is safe to fly or not. Why? It damaged the trust so badly with the FAA and Boeing and that relationship between them. It damaged it so badly that they don't even trust it anymore. Other reasons led to that. President Trump actually went to Vietnam to sell the 737s to Vietnam, to their airlines over there. That's not atypical. That happens a lot when these meetings go behind closed doors. You buy our airplanes, we'll buy your guns, whatever the deals are. But those are the deals that are made, unfortunately. But that relationship is strained right now. It's strained significantly. The only ones that I don't think are even considering that are the UK, real strong ties there. The French have not shown that they want to, and I think that's primarily because that's where Airbus is built. So if Airbus is built, then what's the United States going to do? If they break the interchangeable agreement, then it won't go both ways. So that's one of the things that Fyong Liu is coming to the United States to meet with Dan Elwell and with Elaine Chao about. How do we handle that? How do we handle that interchange agreement? It's going to go beyond the Department of Transportation. It's also going to go into the Department of Commerce. That's going to be a big discussion. Cruz is the head of the aviation subcommittee right now, and he's called a meeting, he's called a hearing. I hope I don't get called to go to those, because they're not very fun. I've been in one before and I didn't like it a bit. But that's one of the things he's going to be looking at. Not only that, but the organizational DARs. So a lot of what that is where the FAA doesn't actually do the surveillance. They let the carrier, or they let the manufacturer hire their people to do their own safety inspections. Well, it was a good program. I was part of the development of it. I was the National Business Process Development Lead for the international community. So I was writing these processes for how you delegate work, how you do it. Well, I haven't been there for a while, so I don't know how it's going so far, but it doesn't seem to be going too well. So, for example, most of the airplanes that you fly on today, the maintenance is not done in the United States. It's done in Mexico. It could be done in South America. It could be done in Russia. Actually, there's a location in Russia. So all of the maintenance on these airplanes, the large maintenance, can be done anywhere in the world. And that's why this interchange agreement was so important, so incredibly important. And I fear for the fact that if it does get damaged, which if we don't handle it carefully right now, it will be damaged. And that's why I'm going to be working closely with Elaine Chao and with Fyong Liu to try to, with the World Aviation Forum, which is kind of our role. We're the independent third party on this. So I'm hoping that we can keep that on track. But, does that answer that question a little bit? Okay. We ready to start some questions? Great.
I wonder if you could talk about this Boeing situation. You said this was essentially an engineering problem. Mm-hmm. Does that mean they're going to have to re-engineer this plane and go back to an engineering thing, or is there a workaround for this?
That's an excellent question. So the idea of engineering, the way that it's done, there's 4 tiers to the safety system. The type certificate data sheet being the first one, the manufacturer's inspections being the next one is how they manufacture, then the airworthiness certificate, and then the operator certificate. So that's the 4 levels of certification. The first level of certification, the type certificate, as we talked about before, type certificate will probably not have to be looked at again. It won't have to go to that depth. So that saves years, first of all. The second level, the manufacturing level, is where these mistakes were made when they changed the angle. The challenge with that is when the type certificate is issued, and especially for this airplane, the training systems that are designed way back there, you know. So now at this point, everybody's been trained, they learned how to do it, they learned how to operate it. And so after the Lion Air accident, they did just that. They went back and they said, well, we're just gonna handle the training aspect, and we're going to try to teach the pilots that when this happens, lean down and push this switch down here. But unfortunately, that's not something a pilot's trained to do. That's not something a pilot typically does. If there's a runaway trim, which happens, and the nose goes down, like the Alaska airplane that crashed out in California, if that starts happening, there's a process. They pull out the checklist and they say, we're gonna do these things. There is no checklist for this. There wasn't. There is now. But now you're changing the whole way that they do training. So yeah, I do believe that they're going to have to go back and recertify that MCAS system in a couple of ways. One is they're going to have to put limits on it. They're going to have to make it go slower when it does try to compensate. And they're going to have to change the angle of attack indicators and make sure that they are not failing and that they take information from 2 instead of 1. But that is a major software redesign that has to go through all the testing and all that all over again. So.
The
No, it will not. It will not. Each system is certified on its own, unless it's an integrated system.
I'm curious about the data streaming that you described, that you subscribe to as an insider, and we're always hearing about nothing is known until the black boxes are open. Black boxes, black boxes. If Malaysia Air had this data streaming, or did it not for some reason, why is it that their complete disappearance as to almost which ocean it was in is completely unknown?
Good question again. The ADS-B system, the satellite system that we have, was available for MH370, but they didn't subscribe to it. It would have cost about another 15 or 20 cents per ticket for those passengers to have that system, but Malaysia Airlines decided they didn't need it, tragically. But on this one, the ADS-B, I love your comment about the black boxes, because that's exactly what I said, and I wish I had time to show you these videos, but they're available online. You can, especially on Twitter. If you follow me on Twitter, it's just @David_Soucie. And you'll see all of this as it's happening, because I tweet everything that goes on. And so if you look at that, you'll see that the night before the FAA grounded the aircraft, I was talking with John Voss on CNN International, and he asked me pretty much the same question. And I said, well, I don't understand why the FAA says they don't have enough data. I have enough data. It's right in front of me right now. And the fact that they think that they have to go to the site and dig the black box out of the dirt to find out what we already know is archaic, and it's ignorant. And so that's the way I see it. It's really, there's 10,000 data points in the cockpit data recorder. 10,000 data points that come across every 10 seconds. That's how much data is on that box. So there's a lot, and that costs money to transmit, but just the basic things, yeah, you should know. Like, for example, where you are. Go ahead.
We used to live in a town, Danville, California, that had a local hero that was of recent, from an aviation background, Captain Sully. And, you know, it appears that in his case, things worked out right for him in terms of how the captain responded to a critical situation. And I wonder if you'd answer a couple of questions. Is there significant more need for training of pilots and captains to be able to respond as the systems become much more complex in terms of how they fly? And then, is there a significant difference between Airbus and Boeing in terms of the issues that each plane has?
Yeah, great. Well, I'll address the first one about Sully. And he and I have talked about this before, that the real heroes that he believes, and I was with the FAA for about 10 years before that accident happened, and we had a real serious problem with jet aircraft at the time, and that was that if you ditched an airplane on the water, it sunk fast. And most of the people died in the water. Most people survive ditchings, but they don't last in the water because they can't get out of the airplane quickly enough. So what we did is we redesigned the aircraft, and the aircraft that he landed had this redesign on it. And what that design did is it had check valves, one-way check valves, that would let the air, stop the air from going out, and it would stop the water from coming in if you ditched it. We also added a switch that says ditch, which most airplanes had at that point, but they didn't cut off the air or the water coming into the cabin. They cut off everything going to the engine, and they cut off a couple of escapes, and they prepared the airplane to ditch. But they didn't really do much to keep the water from coming in. So the engineers worked on that for 7 years to try to put it into the new aircraft that were coming out and to retrofit some aircraft that didn't have it in the first place. So the fact that that airplane, what he did was the best any human being could have ever done. And I talked to him about atrophy of vigilance, and he says, I don't have any. And I believe it. It's the only person in the world I would agree with. But the fact that he saw that anomaly and reacted the way he did is really, really something to be said for the way that he thinks. On the other hand of that, how many hours did Sully have? 25,000 hours? The pilot of this airplane had 8,000 hours. But those are different hours. Sully flew most of those hours. Flew in them. The pilots today, with 8,000 hours, we estimate have about 200 hours of actually flying the airplane. 200 hours to 8,000. It's frightening. It really is. So does training fix that? Somewhat. Somewhat. So a lot of people are mixing crews. You have a high-hour pilot with a low-hour pilot, because the new pilots that have just been trained and they don't have that institutionalized thinking are much better at recognizing anomalies because they don't have it burned into their head. They don't have that routine burned into their head. So we're doing that with a lot of, they call it CRM, Cockpit Resource Management, which is where back in the day, back in the 60s and 70s, you wouldn't dare tell the captain as a second in command, you would never tell a captain that he made a mistake or that there's something going wrong. And that caused a lot of accidents. So at least we're past that, and now we're getting more to a mixed crew.
Yeah, I wanted to.
About flight, solid river flight.
Oh,
Part of the reason the plane stayed water floating was that the fuel tanks were almost full, and jet fuel is considerably lighter than water. So there was a buoyancy factor, and the wings were still intact. So a lot of that was just because it stayed floating because it was lighter.
Okay. Yeah.
No, it's only 6 pounds per gallon.
Yeah, as opposed to 8.
Water, 8.6 pounds.
Right, right. Good point.
Next question's in the center here.
Yeah, so a question and then a comment. So and kind of following what was asked before, will there be more training in these simulators? I know we've got at Stapleton, so will there be a change of training or a change of simulators to accommodate this so pilots can be trained on what they need to be with this? The comment is, I've just completed 2 OSHA lifelong learning OLLI classes, one on aviation and one on cognitive function, which I think both apply to what you're saying.
Yes.
In the aviation, one of the presenters was a pilot that was trained on, quote, old school system where you flew the plane, like so. And on the cognitive function, and that class here in Denver's, Ollie West, are you familiar with Ollie? OSHA.
No.
Okay, well, it's OSHA Lifelong Learning. Probably a lot of us in here are familiar with that, but there's courses, and the cognitive function will be offered again in the Ollie West.
Great.
And it really talks about, and a lot of this comes out of Harvard, about the brain, about the function. Yes, it shrinks, but we do gain. Good news, we gain wisdom as we get older, okay? But what affects that? A lot of it has to do with diet and exercise.
True.
But that's right here. I don't think the aviation class is going to be redone, but a lot of what you're saying, I've just heard in these courses.
Great.
And the question
Thank you.
about changing the simulators,
Yeah, the simulators are, I've crashed, I've had the opportunity to crash that simulator several times, or a couple of them down there. I'm not a pilot. I don't profess to be a pilot. I've got some hours, but I'm not a pilot. But so the training, the simulators can be rephased to have any failure that you want to have, and that's what they are doing now as part of this response to the MAX 8, is reprogramming them to put that into the curriculum for the training.
Dave, I followed your discussion, how you talked about the software and the engineering conflict between limited outlooks in terms of how they looked at each of their part of their task. But I'm thinking about Boeing. Boeing builds the F-15, spaceships, an awful lot of technological things. And it just, from what you've said, I can't quite determine your point of view, but it seems to me like 2 things went wrong here. One is that the FAA did not really adequately certify this upgrade. And Boeing cut a lot of corners here to save money to sell this plane. And as a result of both of those things, we may have forfeited our leadership as a country with the certification process that you were just talking about internationally. So
Yes.
I'd like to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah. Well, the FAA has always been the world safety leader, without question. And again, and that's evidenced in the fact that one of my roles with the FAA was to basically teach the FAA or the Chinese leaders how to do regulatory oversight. I was the administrator for the Online Safety Information Sharing System, OASIS, which was a direct line budget to the president. It didn't go through the FAA at all. It was a system that was meant to address these kinds of things. And I think we've come a long way with that. The fact that the culture at Boeing allowed this to happen is tragic. It began, I think, back in the organizational delegation, which began before that with the FAA cuts. So there were severe budget cuts, and we were told in 96, 98, that we had to cut back our budget. We had to do more with less. That's what we had to do. So we found ways to do that. So the organizational, the delegation of the inspections, taking us out of the safety system and becoming the safety oversight. So the FAA didn't want to be the person that found the tire that needed to be replaced. They didn't want to be the people who said your engineering was wrong. The FAA wanted to say, you have to have a recurring continuous improvement safety system and prove to us you have that. And if you have that, then you're going to catch these things. Great idea. It's worked for a lot of years. It really has. It didn't work on the 787 because the same thing happened there. 787, if you remember the batteries, the lithium batteries that they had installed on those airplanes, that fleet was also grounded for the same exact thing. I just read the report from the NTSB on that recently came out, and it said basically the same things about Boeing that it's saying right now about this aircraft. So it's economically driven, it's mistakes, it's things that happen. I can't find a tie exactly to that because I'm not at that level, but I do suspect it. I certainly suspect it, and I think that the oversight, there's something about the external oversight. The idea of the program, by the way, was that they would have external people within the organizational DAR program. But the fact is, they're still working for Boeing. They're being paid from Boeing. They're being contracted with Boeing. They're part of that. Their livelihood relies on that money and what they're doing. If they don't respond quickly to the things that Boeing wants to do, they'll find somebody else who will. And that's what happens. And that's, I believe, what happened with this airplane. I'd like to go back just to this other question for a second about the difference between Boeing and Airbus. So I was the communications lead on a program that the president demanded after the Aloha aircraft accident, and it was, after the Air Alaska accident, and to look at how we certify airplanes. It was called the Commercial Airplane Certification Process Study, and you can look that up if you're interested in that kind of thing. But within that, we had a lot of findings around this very issue, first of all, mostly about communication between those 4 levels that we just discussed earlier. But what was interesting to me is as I went to Toulouse, France, and looked at Airbus. We did an in-depth study, not just of how they do their work, but their culture there. Then we went to Boeing and did the same thing. Really, really, really different. If you interviewed the guy that was putting together this angle of attack indicator and installing it on the airplane over at Boeing, he would be the best person at doing that, but he would have no idea what that thing does. None whatsoever. And Boeing wants it that way because they trust in their system, their safety system, to find problems and things like that. They would put that angle of attack indicator on there, and they did it really well. They did it better than anybody else that could ever do it. It was like it was their life's purpose to do that angle of attack indicator installation and use the right screws and make sure all the screws are lined up the right way and the whole thing. You go to Airbus, the person that puts their angle of attack indicator on, when you ask them about what they're doing, they will tell you how important that piece is, and it's the only piece that really matters on that airplane. And it's true of the culture there. I'm not saying one's better than the other, I'm really not. But you could see that they each had their benefits. They each did. So if the guy knows all about how to hook this thing up, maybe he's not installing the screws right. Maybe, you know what I mean? There's something more to that. But on the other hand, I prefer the culture that says, I know what I'm doing and I know what this thing does and how important it is to flying the aircraft. They had a direct line of sight to safety and to getting that passenger, and they would actually talk about the passengers and the people that were flying on that airplane, and their lives rely on that particular piece. But go ahead.
We've got a question over here.
Oh, sorry.
And then you can wait, and then I'll
Getting out of sync here.
If you could, appreciate all your comments, and we've learned a lot. With respect to this recent incident with Ethiopian Air, if you could comment on the following situation: is that there was a pretty serious incident before that with Lion Air, and if that incident had happened in the U.S., would things have been different? Why 2 crashes to do this? Was there enough done after the first one? Just take the Ethiopian Air
No.
out of question.
I'll answer that. No, there was not. But I knew about the Ethiopian Air, and I commented on it. We talked about it a lot. And I think I, too, was kind of stuck in that idea that, Boeing knows what they're doing. They build all kinds of stuff. They're pretty smart people. They wouldn't let this happen. They couldn't let this happen. If it wasn't safe to put another airplane out, they wouldn't. And so, yeah, I'm shocked as well about that. The fact that it happened, and especially when I saw the data that showed me exactly that it was very, very similar, almost parallel with what happened to Lion Air, and yet I wouldn't have done anything with it either. I've given that a lot of thought, and I think that I'm even stuck in this paradigm, which is that if there was an engine that fell off of that airplane, something physical that you could see, that an aileron fell off and that caused the crash, or it was something that we understand as human beings, I think then it would have been grounded immediately, the fleet. The same thing with the batteries on the 787. Those lithium batteries were causing fires on board the airplane. It's something physical. You can see that happen. You can see that it's going to happen. It's going to cause a problem. So we have to react to it because it's right in front of us. Software isn't that way. It was software. You can fix it. Do we really understand what it does? No. What's an MCAS? I don't know. I didn't know what it was until about October last year. I'm supposed to know this stuff. So, does that answer your question? Okay.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on the Atlas 7.6 in Houston?
Atlas 7.6 in Houston. You're going to have to refresh my memory. Give him back the microphone. Oh, the cargo airplane. I'm sorry. Oh, man. Oh, the guys at Atlas would kill me right now. Oh, my gosh. I have a good friend. His name's Ben. I got it. Yeah, a good friend, his name is Ben, and he called me right after that accident because he had a good friend that was flying that airplane. He goes, what's with the news not covering this thing? He goes, is it just because it's cargo, just because there were 4 lives instead of 150 that you spend all this time talking about it? And the truth is, that is kind of what it is. It really is tragic. So one of the things I did do with Atlas, like I said, Ben called me, we talked about it, and before this all happened, I was going to be involved in that investigation a little bit. But unfortunately, I'm not because I'm in this part now. But they feel that was a load shift, that it wasn't strapped down properly, and it slid forward. And you can imagine center of gravity. You think about how the center of gravity on these airplanes can only vary by about 4 feet. That's it. So it doesn't take much to put something out of gravity, and once it's angling forward, everything can slide forward, and that's what we believe happened to that airplane. It's tragic. But again, who loaded the airplane? Was it reckless? Did he intentionally load the airplane wrong? Or was there some process, some system that wasn't done properly? And does that need to be fixed, and how can it be fixed? That's what we do as safety experts. We look at it that way. We don't try to hang somebody up by their toes like we used to do in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. When someone did something wrong, we blame them. Fire them. Get somebody in here who can do it. We don't do that anymore.
I think I managed to turn this off. No, it's okay. Well, first thing I'd like to say, having spent a lot of my years in aviation, is the safety record in the world today, considering especially China and every place else where you talk about thousands and thousands and thousands of new pilots and new airplanes and new airports and everything else. It is an incredible safety record.
Yes, it is.
He's responsible for some of it, and so are some of the others. And what's happening right now, I don't know, with our trade wars and our other things, a lot of countries around the world don't trust the United States anymore, period. And, but the question I've got is, you say it's a software problem, but you said, which I didn't know before, there was an angle attack indicator. The Air France accident was a pitot tube. They're not software problems, they're mechanical problems.
Right.
So, I mean, where do you go? I'm just saying.
Where do I
that
draw the line?
the incidents that started those things were 3 mechanical problems.
Right, right. And, you know, I might have touched on it a little earlier that every accident I've ever investigated has had at least 3 primary contributing factors. It's like a stool with 3 legs. If one of them goes away, the airplane doesn't crash. And every single accident that I've either been at, investigated, or did a post-analysis on, that's the case. So, yeah, the angle of attack indicator. The reason I say it's a software problem is because of the fact that the software didn't perform with that failure the way it should have. It's a triple redundant system, and that's not what they did. Triple redundancy means that if that angle of attack indicator fails, that single point of failure, then it should have been reading from the other angle of attack indicator, and it didn't. So that's where I see the software problem as being the critical factor. The fact that other things fail, they fail on airplanes all the time. They do. But because it's designed to triple redundancy, that's why rarely do you see an accident, and that contributes to. Does anybody know what 6 sigma means? Okay, so 6 sigma means that of 1 million opportunities to fail or succeed, that an event only happens three times to the negative and 3 times to the positive. That's 6 sigma, that's your sigma. So of 1 million times. So think of all the systems that are on this airplane, and they're all designed, each one of them, to 10 to the minus 9 safety factor. So now you got 1 million times 10 million times 1 billion. So you've got all these opportunities for things to fail, but our safety system right now in the FAA and the United States is 6 sigma. It's about 1/1,000,000th of 6 sigma. That's how safe it is. That is so safe. That's like one of these fibers in the carpet failing in this entire room. That's how safe it is. So when we talk about these things, as Debbie started out in the first place, is we don't want you to be afraid to fly. Honestly, walking up those stairs is more dangerous than flying, by far. So we don't want you to be afraid to fly. Be like my mother. Read my book, and you'll feel better about flying.
Will you please,
Oh, we have another
please
question.
come back and talk to us
Well,
about...
that was my big ending. Come on.
Oh.
No, I'm just kidding.
We need you to come back and talk to us about neuroplasticity.
I would love to, but I probably would bring Rudy with me if I did
Okay, that would be even great.
Okay, good.
So I want to go back to PK's question a little bit because I think there's still that looming question about what if this happened in the United States, or why aren't we seeing these things in the United States? Why is it Malaysia and France and Indonesia and Ethiopia? Why haven't we seen such a tragedy happen here?
That's really, in 10 years, we've had 1 death. 1 death in 10 years in our safety system here. That one piece of fiber in the carpet, I guess. Partly it's because of the awareness and the understanding of the new safety management systems that the carriers in the United States have embraced. The idea of continuous improvement. They have, and I've attended many of these, weekly meetings. And in these meetings, they talk about potential failures. These 6 sigma things I was talking about are not things that fail, they're things that could fail. And so those are the things that they talk about now. It's an entirely different culture. Another thing that I was the director of, or the program manager for, was the VASIP system, which is Voluntary Action Safety Information Protocol or something like that. And what that is the pilots can voluntarily disclose a safety faux pas that they made. They can voluntarily say, you know, I screwed up. I didn't put the flaps up, and I continued to fly that airplane all the way to Cleveland with the flaps in 5 degrees down. Somebody ought to look at that airplane because it's probably screwed up. And they have no way that they're going to be chastised for that because it wasn't reckless. It wasn't even careless. It was just an oversight on their part. So I think that has a lot to do with that. The other countries, the other worlds, have different cultures than we do, and they don't embrace this kind of idea as well. So I think that their training doesn't sink in the same way that it does in the United States. And I think a lot of these countries, particularly China, has the idea that they have to be part of the safety system, the solution. And I don't believe that. I believe that we, as the FAA and the regulator, are there to set up the safety system and to make sure that they have their own safety system that does this. So I'm a strong believer in that. I feel like I'm not answering the question, though. What am I missing? Oh, okay, so in the other countries, too, it's not a carelessness, but it is to do with money. Almost every other country, there's only one other country I know of that doesn't supplement their airline industry. Almost all of the other countries, whether it's a manufacturer, whether it's an operator, whatever it is, the money for those countries comes from other sources, or for those operators, comes from either their own government or from the United States. In Ethiopia, for example, the first 10 airplanes that they bought were paid for by the United States back in the 60s. They were paid for by the United States to help their country become more advanced. And that paid off. That airline is a very successful airline. So, but we have been very fortunate about it. Part of the reason, too, if you think about it, is that we don't do a lot of, in the United States, we don't do as much long routes overseas and into smaller airports. I mean, we do here, but the legs that other airlines fly are not in better. Here, if I have a problem and I'm flying, I can land anywhere and get my aircraft worked on. I can get it anywhere, get it taken care of. In other countries, that doesn't happen. They land, they have a problem, they write it down somewhere, maybe a napkin, but they don't tell anybody, and then they think they're okay and they take off. That's happened at least 3 accidents I can recall in the last 10 years. So perhaps that's it. I don't really have an answer.
We have time for just one last question.
I have a question. Southwest Airlines has the most amount of, the greatest number of these planes. And then we have 2 other airlines, United and American, that fly the same airline, same planes.
Yeah.
How come the accident didn't happen with Southwest Airlines, which had the most of these uses most of these planes? How come it happened in Ethiopia? Why didn't it happen in the United States? Is there something different about the planes that Southwest has than the ones that was flying in Ethiopia?
There's a difference in Southwest. Now that I'm not with the FAA, I'll tell you how I feel about that. I'll give you an example of Southwest Airlines. And American and United are very similar, but I didn't have an experience with them, so I'll tell you about this one. So I was doing surveillance on Southwest Airlines. And one of the things that we did as an FAA safety inspector is we'd go into their operations center and we would say to the operator at random, that airplane right there on your computer screen just had a failure of the left engine. What are you going to do? And then they had to go through and set up where they're going to reposition the airplanes, how many pilots are going to exceed their flight time, and they have to rotate those crews out. The amount of logistics that goes through that, for that one little thing that I pointed at the screen, is huge what they actually have to go through. Right when that happened, another aircraft actually did go down with an engine failure almost at the same time in another location. And I said, okay, forget the drill, let's do that. So he did. So he started repositioning airplanes. He started doing this and doing that. The model of aircraft, it didn't have enough fuel. They couldn't get enough fuel. They were at a smaller airport. They couldn't get the tire changed or whatever it was on that plane. So they had to rotate around. It ended up affecting 25 different airplanes, different schedules, because of that one failure in that one airplane. When he got ready to execute, you set it all up and you get it ready to go and you say, execute. You know, on computers, when you do that, it either does one thing or the other, but sometimes it gives you a blue screen and says, whoops, you know. Other times, most of the time, it'll say yes or no. Yes or no. This didn't do that. There's a book out called The Southwest Way, recommended reading, The Southwest Way. And what happens when he got ready to execute that button, he pushed it and it said no, and then it said do the right thing. Do the right thing. What does it do to your head? It gives me goosebumps, just because I was there maybe. But do the right thing. Is yes the right thing? Makes you wonder. So before you just push it and say, I'm going for it, it makes you think. It affects that part of your brain that was that atrophy of vigilance, the intellectual thinking, the institutionalized way of doing things. Because you don't want just somebody who's going to affect 25 airplanes and thousands of lives with that one button to just routinely say, yep. Okay? So that, I believe, is why Southwest Airlines is as good as they are. And that's why most American carriers have started that philosophy. And we call that the safety management system. And I was proud to be part of the development of that. We learned it, we didn't invent it, we learned it from Sandia Laboratories. Sandia Laboratories does the safety work for nuclear facilities. And we learned that safety management and risk management system from them and applied it to the United States.
So then the planes for Southwest are physically the same as the one that was in Ethiopia?
Yes, but the culture is very different from Ethiopia. Very different. And that culture about training, the culture of awareness, the culture of how to handle an anomaly. They have training. They've had my course. They've done the repair course. Unfortunately, Boeing has too. But Boeing's course was for their new leadership training. That they have a new leaders coming up, and thankfully those new leaders are not in control yet. They will be in 5-10 years probably. But so they're learning this culture. They're aware of it, and they want to learn how to do this and how to awaken that thinking in their head. So
anyone who's a Southwest frequent flyer should have gotten a note from Gary Kelly a couple of days ago about how many aircraft they have, and only 34 of them for MAX 8 are all out of service.
Yep.
The rest of them, they have 760 airplanes. They have more airplanes than any U.S. airline.
Right.
And they're all variants of 737s, but it's only like 4% of the fleet.
Mm-hmm. I did get from a pilot, a MAX Air pilot, the other day. He tweeted me or private messaged me, but told me that he did get the training after the Lion Air accident. There was extensive training that they gave them about how to handle these situations and why it is what it is. The other thing that's interesting about Southwest is every airplane that they ordered, even before the Lion Air accident, so they were aware of this problem. They had it occur to them before, but they were able to turn it off properly. Every airplane after that was ordered with a secondary angle of attack indicator on the screen that they look at all the time. So if this happens, they can look at that and say, oh, that's an error in the reading, I'm turning this off.
So there was something different in the Southwest planes that second one that I haven't heard about was not in the Ethiopian plane. The second indicator.
The second indicator was ordered. They don't have them yet. No, on future orders that they had made, it takes a few years to get that order through. So the ones that they've ordered, the ones they ordered before the Lion Air accident, they ordered with this, so that tells me that they knew the situation was there. And they were ahead of it. They were way ahead of it because their safety management system knew about it. They had reported it. The pilot said, I had this weird thing happen, and that's what happened on that. So.
Thankfully, these crashes are very rare. Dave, thank you for informing us of the technological reliance in airflight.
Thank you.